are in Worcester, Massachusetts with Dr. Dagli, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at College of the Holy Cross. Dr. Dagli recently wrote an article in The Atlantic called The Phony Islam of ISIS, in which he discusses the group's theology, the nuances of the Islamic legal tradition, and how Muslims should respond when militant groups around the world that identify as Muslims use theological arguments to justify their actions. Dr. Dagli, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure.
So, coming straight to your article in The Atlantic, it was essentially a response to the cover piece by Mr. Graham Wood. His article was What ISIS Really Wants, and he asserted that ISIS's actions are deeply rooted in Islamic theology and traditions, and quote, "The fighters of the Islamic State are authentic throwbacks to early Islam and are faithfully reproducing its norms of war." If ISIS indeed follows the Quran and prophetic methodology, what is phony about ISIS's Islam?
A little bit of, you might say, inside baseball about how these things happen. Authors don't usually choose the titles of the articles. So the phony Islam of ISIS was chosen for me. But it fits. It reasonably fits. The original idea was to say what other Muslims really want. And so the argument of Wood's article was not just a single argument that he was making. He was saying that he was trying to describe the self-image of the ISIS fighters and of the ISIS ideology, and he was trying to give a kind of a portrait, you might say, a kind of a journalistic portrait of some of the, well, he didn't really go to speak to the ISIS fighters directly, but he spoke with some of their supporters in countries like Australia and London and so forth and so on. And from my point of view, that's perfectly fine. That's something actually that I'm interested in. I would be curious to know what is the self-image of these ISIS fighters and ideologues. What do they think about themselves? How do they relate themselves to other Muslims? And I think from that point of view, having a long piece of journalism about a phenomenon like the so-called Islamic State is not just acceptable, but I would say necessary. But he took the argument further than that, and he constructed an argument mainly using this professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University, Bernard Haeckel, trying to make an argument that not only do the ISIS fighters see themselves as being serious, but he implied, without coming out and saying it in so many words, that really they in fact are legitimately serious, that they do follow the Quran and the example of the Prophet quite diligently and seriously. So there's words scattered throughout the article like faithful, following the norms of being serious, being assiduous, and so forth and so on. Now these, in my view, are not journalistic judgments. These are theological judgments. These are interpretive judgments. These are, in my view, Graham Wood looking at the interpretation and the views, the practices of ISIS, and making a judgment about whether he thinks this is faithful to the teachings of Islam or not. Now, he perhaps doesn't think that he's doing this, or he tried to do it in a way that he distanced himself from doing so. But I think, and this was really the main point of my argument, I think if you look at how the article was constructed, it becomes pretty clear that a person walking away from that would believe that the ISIS interpretation of Islam, the interpretation by these extremist takfiri jihadists, is actually plausible. That's another word he's used, and not a stretch from the Quran and the Hadith. And that I found to be quite irresponsible, because if he had made that judgment after having balanced out, let's say, the views of these ISIS ideologues, and let's suppose brought in the views of other Muslims and then gauged their arguments against each other, that may have been a little bit better. But the only other views he brought in were other people who were nearly as extreme as ISIS in their views, with the exception that they weren't pursuing violence right now, who he called quietist Salafis. Anyway, not to get too far into the details right now, but the main overarching point was that rather than simply providing a description of ISIS's views and its vision of itself, He then, you might say, crossed the boundary into making a judgment as to whether he thought this was actually faithful to the Quran, faithful to the teachings of Islam or not. And he did it, in a sense, using Bernard Haeckel, this Princeton professor, as a kind of a prop, sort of taking his quotations and then constructing the argument. But it is essentially Wood's argument.
Right.
And whether or not it's Haeckel's argument is a separate question.
But Dr. Haeckel himself, I mean, isn't he a religious scholar, or doesn't he have deep knowledge of not just the region, but also the religion? So to use his sort of argument and sort of what his knowledge of Islam and the religion is, I think from the article we can gauge is that he also felt that ISIS's actions and deeds and words are deeply rooted in the Islamic tradition. So how would you respond to that?
I think when you say deeply rooted, you have to unpack that just a little bit. The way in which Wood and also Haeckel in the piece, and also in some separate interviews about the piece, talked about deeply rooted. Well, look, if slavery is mentioned in the Constitution, which it is, the 3/5 vote and so forth, the American Constitution, does that mean that if someone in Mississippi tried to reinstitute slavery, he would be reinstituting something that was, quote unquote, deeply rooted in American law? I mean, you could make a very bad argument in that regard, but it really wouldn't amount to much if you actually looked at the logic behind it. And I quite simply was, if I can be honest, I was a little baffled by Haeckel's rather blasé assertions about how these vicious and really cruel practices were, quote unquote, clearly in the texts. They were so obviously there. He used the phrasing like right there in the mainstream and so forth and so on. I am still quite shocked and disappointed that a credentialed, prominent professor of Islamic studies would make these kind of judgments. And moreover, I think he's perhaps unconsciously or otherwise making a confusion or kidding himself when he says things like, Islam is simply what Muslims do. This is sort of the kind of interpretive or philosophical axiom that is sometimes used in religious studies as a way of maintaining a kind of a critical distance.
Right.
You presume not to take a position and say, well, I think this Christianity is better or that Christianity is worse. As a scholar, you're supposed to say, look, I'm not going to judge Christianity. I'm not going to judge whether I think the Trinity is true or not, for example. I will just use as a methodology the assumption that Christianity is simply what Christians do. It's a sort of good, rough and ready rule, but it doesn't actually hold up logically, you might say, because you first have to decide who you think the Christians are.
Right. Before
you can then make a judgment that says Christianity is what Christians do. And if you push somebody to say, well, Islam is simply what Muslims do, which is what the Wood says in the article and Haeckel has said on more than one occasion, then you have to ask that person, all right, well, what is your standard for determining who gets to be called a Muslim or not? Right. And then the judgment comes in.
Sure.
Now, no one can escape this. It's not as though it's a negative thing, but you have to be upfront and honest. And I've had a conversation with Wood, following up on his article, and it was very telling to me that when I asked him what he thought the limits were, the broad bounds of Islam, he said, I'm not taking a judgment on who is a good or bad Muslim, except with very broad bounds, he said. And I said, well, what are those broad bounds? And he said, well, if someone was drinking beer or eating pork, I would begin to wonder. Wow. And I said, well, that's interesting. I said, I begin to wonder when people murder communities who have made an explicit agreement of peace with the Prophet. And in fairness, he took the point. In other words, for him, what was obviously put someone out of Islam was pork and alcohol, but not murder and mass murder.
Right.
And that, in a sense, betrays the assumptions of what you think Islam can be. I mean, he explicitly thought, well, this mass murder is kind of equivocal, it's ambiguous, maybe Islam supports it, maybe it doesn't. But he didn't have that same ambiguity about dietary laws, which, if we're being serious, is much less of a crime than mass murder, obviously. So that I think exposes some of the assumptions. I mean, I think religious scholars can't hide behind axioms like Islam is just what Muslims do. They are making their judgments, which is fine. They should just be honest about them.
But then how would you define what the boundaries of Islam are? Is it what Islam was in terms of how it was manifest in the Prophet's life and his words and actions in the prophetic tradition? Is it what's in the Quran? Is it what the Islamic legal tradition tells us? Or is it what Muslims do? How would you define? What is that standard against which we can measure other Muslims?
It's almost always not necessary to define whether or not someone is a Muslim or not. And that's actually one of the problems. We don't have to decide whether we can call such and such person a Muslim or such and such person not a Muslim or something like that. These were important questions in times when, for example, your religious identity said something about, let's say, your political identity. So if you were in the millet system in the Ottoman Empire, whether you were a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim had a bearing on what kind of legal responsibilities and rights you had and what community you belonged to, which court would you go to, for example. That would be determined on that basis. But for the most part, this is really a kind of a personal question. It's not a question that anyone is obligated to decide. It's really between a person and God.
Sure.
I would personally define who is a Muslim quite broadly. I would, I mean, there are definitions in the Islamic tradition. Essentially, anyone who prays to the Qibla, that is to say, anyone who prays towards Mecca, and anyone who considers that to be their direction of prayer, is considered to be a Muslim, no matter how many prayers they miss or how many crimes they commit. And there's different opinions on that. I think when you come to the normative question, in other words, who is a good Muslim? Well, then you can ask me personally what I think, and that's, that's a big question. But I think one doesn't even need to get to that. My big problem with the way the discourse is unfolded and with this particular article is that there's a kind of a conflation and a confusion between whether or not you call someone like, let's say, Osama bin Laden or the leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, or these ISIS fighters, Islamic or not. Because there's two senses in which, in the English language, as I mentioned in my article, in which this word can be used. You can call someone or something Islamic in English usage simply as a way of designating that it comes from that civilization. It comes from that area of that sector of humanity. So so if I say that that ISIS is Islamic, it could simply mean that I'm saying it didn't come out of Japanese or Chinese or Indian or Native American civilization. It's from this part of the world. It's Islamic because it's quite obvious they speak Islamic languages, they base themselves on Islamic texts, the way that they dress is influenced by Islamic norms and so forth and so on. So in that sense, it's quite uncontroversial to say that ISIS is Islamic. It comes out of the Islamic world. The other sense of Islamic, which is used in English and has in the modern period been used by Muslims, is to define how good or bad a person is in terms of their Islam. People didn't used to actually talk like this in the Islamic world. You wouldn't have talked about Islamic dress. It's funny because we always talk about Islamic dress.
Sure.
People talk about the hijab as being Islamic dress, is a beard Islamic, and so forth and so on. That word in Arabic or in other Islamic languages, Islami, right, or the equivalent of Islamic, was never used as a legal or theological category. It just didn't exist.
Wow.
But we've come to use it now because in the discourse we usually are in a position of trying to distinguish ourselves, one group from another group, and the word Islamic is a kind of a handy distinction.
Sure.
But all throughout Wood's article, and actually in some of the responses that Haeckel provides afterwards, there's a confusion. In one sentence, it'll be Islamic in the sense of coming out of the Islamic world, and in the next sentence, it'll be Islamic in the sense of judging how good or bad a person is.
Sure.
It's like American, right? If I'm an American, one definition is someone who carries an American passport. It doesn't matter. Charles Manson is American in that sense.
Right.
But then American in the sense of the American dream. Oh, that's
the values.
The values. Oh,
right.
That's un-American, or it's American as apple pie. That becomes a normative description.
Sure.
Of what that is, and as long as you don't confuse it, that's fine. I mean, you can't insist that language change. Scholars have tried. They've tried to use words like Islamdom, Islamicate. These haven't caught on.
Right.
But it's necessary to unpack that. And this in logic, there's a thing called the fallacy of equivocation, which is precisely when you use a word that's ambiguous in two ways without, in a sense, announcing that
The
you're
distinction.
making that change.
Sure.
And that has happened quite a lot. And so, I mean, one final thing about this is that Haeckel and Wood kind of criticize Muslims for trying to say that ISIS is un-Islamic.
Right.
But if you really look at the argument, what they're really saying is that you don't have a basis for saying that they're bad Muslims, even, right? That's a different point.
Sure.
And that was really quite objectionable from my point of view.
Right, and I think what you're mentioning here is a quote by Bernard Haeckel that Graham Wood uses, in which he says that Muslims who call ISIS un-Islamic have a cotton candy view of their own religion that overlooks what their religion has historically and legally required. So would you like to elaborate a little bit?
Yeah,
on that?
I think that's just irresponsible. I don't think that, I think that for him to say that was, I'm still amazed by it. And who is he to say so? And if he is saying so, is he making a historical judgment or is he making a normative judgment? Now, the Islamic tradition, just to kind of give a little bit of perspective, the legal tradition is over 1,000 years long. It's covered about a quarter of humanity in many different countries and many different lands, and has a vast, vast legal tradition, tens of thousands of works that we know of, right? I know one Islamic studies scholar in this country who has 50,000 legal books in his library.
Wow.
Just in one person's library,
Wow.
50,000 different legal texts. Now, you can find, if you look hard enough, any legal position that you could possibly imagine that some scholar somewhere has put forward. You can find legal positions that talk about Islam demands world conquest. You can find legal positions that say the exact opposite. And on any specific point of, let's say, punishment or of law, family law, social responsibilities, any subject that you can imagine, you're always going to find the entire spectrum of possibilities somehow filled up. It's not good enough to simply hunt through the tradition, find one person who says something, and then come out and say, you see, this is out of the Islamic tradition.
Sure.
You have to be able to look at it and say, look, this is a tradition, it has a center of gravity, it has a certain mainstream, it has certain fringe ideas, it has certain ideas which are of poor quality, it has certain ideas which are of good quality, it has certain ideas which are rationally argued, certain ones which are simply given as authoritative statements, some of which seem to take into account the entire Quran, the entire Hadith, others which seem a little bit more self-interested and arbitrary. And you cannot dismiss all of these considerations and simply say, well, this exists in a book that is 600 years old, so somehow it must be normative and Islamic.
Right, but don't you think that, I mean, even within the tradition, and whether the 4 schools of thought or 5 schools of thought or however many multiple schools of thought we have within Islamic jurisprudence, there were certain ideas that were more mainstream, and so there was like majority opinion, say, around the concept of jihad.
That's right.
Or the role of women in society.
That's right.
And so some of those positions were more authoritative than others, and they sort of took hold within, Islamic societies sort of around the world over the centuries that have more traction, and people have sort of relied on those to sort of shape
That's right.
current societies.
Yeah. Well, that's true, and that's exactly right. And I think, it's difficult to get into a detailed discussion of, let's say, the positions of the 4 schools of Sunni law or Jafari school on any kind of given position. But I think I can say with some confidence that when Haeckel says that Muslims have a cotton candy view or some kind of view of their religion, I think he's being unfair, and I think he's being dismissive, and he is assuming a certain view of what Islam is actually supposed to be versus what Islam actually has been.
Right.
So ISIS, for example, has executed more people than were executed by Egypt over a course of 800 years.
Wow.
For example. Capital punishment in traditional Islamic societies was incredibly rare, very difficult to justify, and very difficult to actually put into practice because of, for example, the standards of evidence, the ability for people to retract confessions, and all of the other checks and balances that had been built up over centuries into the legal system. And when a person looks at the legal opinions of ISIS, any, you might say, equivalent of junior high or high school student in a traditional madrasa in the Islamic world when the legal tradition was actually robust, would look at this and find it to be really barely literate. Barely literate even in Arabic, never mind in the sources.
Right.
You know, there's a certain minimum level of sophistication, of fairness, of open-mindedness, of balance, of reason that's necessary in order for these legal positions to be taken seriously at all. And you know, I have to be honest. You know, there's a kind of an assumption on people's part, sometimes Muslims as well, that somehow the legal tradition and the spiritual and theological tradition of Islam, the default setting is somehow stern, harsh,
Right.
Uncompromising, absolutist, and so forth and so on. Anyone who has taken a serious look at the legal, theological, exegetical tradition of Islam, the first thing that you're struck by is the openness to diverse opinions, the necessity to be able to defend your positions in a thoroughgoing and rational way, and the emphasis on mercy, the emphasis on compassion, the emphasis on wisdom, on balance, on farsightedness, and so forth and so on. And I think there's a certain amount of bias and bigotry in assuming that if someone picks up a book and waves it in the air and then shoots a gun in the air with the other hand and is immediately harsh, uncompromising, cruel, and aggressive, that this is somehow more faithful to the religion, that this is more serious, that this is somehow more real. And you have to ask the person who's making that assumption, where does that assumption come from?
Right.
Why do you think that this is more authentic? Why do you think that this is more, quote unquote, serious?
Sure.
Why is this more assiduous?
Sure.
Anyone who, in a sense, knows the tradition well, I don't think would make a judgment like this. And if I could, again, I don't mean to make petty criticisms of colleagues, but I think when Heikel, for example, says things like, burning is in the Islamic legal code. This is a quote from him.
Wow.
Burning, so the Jordanian prisoner
Yes.
who was burned
Yes.
alive,
Yes.
which ISIS justified in a kind of perverse logic that, you know, I mean, look at what a bomb does to a person, you know, so what's the difference between a person being, you know, now I don't accept that logic, but that was the logic. Now, for Heikel to say that burning prisoners or burning people is in the Islamic legal code, that to me presents a kind of a baffling ignorance of the fact that there is no such thing as an Islamic legal code. There's not this kind of book called the Islamic
Right.
legal code sitting out there. There's a diverse legal tradition. So it's kind of like saying that bombing is in the Western legal code. There's no Western legal code.
Sure.
There are countries and nations in the West that have different legal systems that say different kinds of things and so forth and so on. And also I challenge him to produce an example of where there's a legal justification in any book of law in the Sunni or Shia tradition that justifies burning alive a prisoner like that.
Right.
I don't think it even exists. But that's not even the problem. The problem is his very framing of the idea and implying to his audience that there's this thing called the Islamic legal code.
Right.
ISIS is following it, and implicitly other Muslims, by not following that, are not so serious.
Right.
They're kind of kidding themselves. They have a cotton candy view of Islam and so forth and so on. That I find to be insidious, because what it's implying is that the rest of the Islamic world are either, number one, ignorant of their tradition,
Right.
or number two, they're being hypocrites. They're being naive.
Right.
They're fooling themselves. And if they were to decide tomorrow to get serious and to really follow their religion seriously, it wouldn't turn them into compassionate, wise, pious, and kind people. It would turn them into ISIS fighters.
Right. Right.
And that was the implication of the argument in Wood's article.
And we'll get to how the Muslim world should respond, because it gets very defensive. Like, you know, Muslim communities around the world, every time there is an attack by a militant group, either, you know, ISIS or Boko Haram or the Taliban, there's this sense of dread, you know, among Muslims. And we'll get to how they should respond, you know, when those things happen and when they're asked and questioned about their faith. But just to, I mean, you mentioned the richness of the Islamic legal tradition. And, you know, when we come to think about people like Osama bin Laden or some of these other groups, even in Pakistan, who use violence to sort of achieve political agendas or political ends. There is, they have somehow, I feel, dismissed the Islamic legal tradition. And rather than sort of, they have bypassed it altogether and have, I think, are engaging with the primary sources directly.
That's right.
Sort of dismissing it. And so what do you think? Do you think that's, in some ways, it's a reformation of sorts, in that they are saying, ijtihad or personal exertion, engagement with the original text is more important than being sort of confined to these schools of thought that have been crystallized over the past few centuries? How would you, but then there are also very, other Muslims who feel like they don't want to be bound by these strictures. They do want to engage with the text independently and using their own reasoning. What do you think of these two approaches? And which of these do you think is a more positive trend?
I think that some of these groups usually referred to as Salafis or Wahhabism and other groups like that, they share actually with some modernist Muslims, those who are a little bit more modern leaning, the idea that the Islamic interpretive tradition can in a sense be just hopped over. You can kind of jump right over it, go right back to the text, and that somehow this is more faithful, more real, more direct. And I think it's a false dichotomy, and actually I think it can actually be pulled off.
Okay.
If we just restrict ourselves to the Quran never existed, not for a second, as a text that was in a sense just floating in the air, self-contained, self-referential, without any need for someone else to explain it. From the very moment that the Quran was revealed, the Prophet was asked about it, and he explained it. He would explain what some of the words meant. The Sahaba would talk to each other about what the Quran meant. They would explain its implications, its grammar, what the various verses meant, and so forth and so on. And in a sense, the tradition of tafsir, the tradition of law, the tradition of theology is a kind of an extension of this activity that began right from the very first generation of Muslims. And whatever the Salafis and I shouldn't say the Salafis, all of the Salafis, whatever this certain mindset thinks about just going quote unquote right back to the sources, they're kidding themselves if they think that they're not relying upon the interpretive tradition to actually make sense of the Quran. The Quran is not comprehensible completely without someone to explain to you what the words in the Quran mean. There are words in the Quran which are simply not explainable in terms of their evident meaning. And this was never seen as a defect. The Quran always existed. It was, you might say, nestled in a community of interpretation. And this was simply always the way that Muslims understood it to be. There was never this idea that you as a Muslim could sort of go to the Quran, open it up, read it, and without any other instruction or any kind of other input, derive not only personal moral instruction, but then also receive instruction on how to treat other people and how to demand conduct from other people. That's quite a leap. That's quite a leap.
Right.
Now, the false dichotomy that I mentioned is that very often the discourse will be that, for example, the people who follow the Hanafi school or the Maliki school or who follow Asharite or Maturidi theology, I mean, there's many different schools, that somehow they follow Abu Hanifa or Imam Malik, whereas we, the pure Muslims, are following the Prophet.
Right.
This is really extremely logically absurd. The reason why Hanafis follow Abu Hanifa is the same reason why, let's say, a Salafi follows a Salafi Sheikh.
Right.
Because he thinks that the Salafi Sheikh is in a better position to explain and interpret and to know what the Quran and the Hadith are saying. And then he in a sense trusts and relies upon that person's expertise in order to then take instruction and to know what to do and what to think. And this is the argument that traditional Muslims give for why they follow the traditional schools of law and the traditional schools of theology. They're saying, look, this work has been done already. In a sense, people have institutionalized and given long and careful thought to how the different verses of the Quran relate to each other, about theological questions, the nature of God, understanding His names, understanding social and legal responsibilities. And we do this not because we worship Abu Hanifa, but because we think that of all of the opinions out there, these are the ones which have the strongest basis for telling us precisely what the Quran and the Sunnah actually have to say. And that when you disregard, it just is, even not arguing from religious obligation, but logically speaking, practically speaking, you have 1,000 years of activity of people who have devoted their lives and devoted their energies in a serious way to trying to make sense of the entire Quran and the entire prophetic tradition, who have been through and made all the mistakes and made the kind of gone on the wrong detours and have discovered that this is the wrong way to approach this question. And you have this wealth and you have this kind of treasury of information, and you're going to throw all of that away, and then you're going to open up the book yourself because you think that you personally are competent to start with a blank slate. I think this is tremendously foolish. And if you look at, for example, Osama bin Laden's fatwa, so-called fatwa, in the 90s justifying the killing of civilians, I mean, it's a silly piece of writing. It doesn't really make a lot of sense if you compare it to what's actually in the tradition itself.
Sure.
And there's a kind of a strange meaning here between the people who are called fundamentalists and also those who are called modernists,
right,
in that they both completely disregard this tradition.
Right.
I don't see why there has to be a contradiction between saying I want to be faithful to the tradition, I want to be faithful to the Quran and the Sunnah, and I also want to make use of this treasury of the tradition. The way I think about it is the following. My own field, I've spent a lot of years working on tafsir, on Quran commentary. The tradition of the exegesis on the Quran, the tafsir, is first of all absolutely necessary. You can't do without it.
Right.
You cannot not have it. You have to have it. But number two, it has many flaws. Right? It has to be navigated. You have to be able to make judgments about whether, because there's differing opinions.
Sure.
So number one, you can't do without it, and number two, you can't simply rely on it as though it were just saying one thing.
Right.
So those two elements have to be kept in tension with one another.
Right.
And what happens often is Muslims think that just because the tradition has flaws, because people have made mistakes, because they've disagreed, that somehow they just have to get rid of it and start from the beginning. But
you would say that that should be the responsibility of Islamic scholars or jurists who know the language, who know the tradition. And I think some of the critics of the tradition would say, both within the Muslim world and outside of it, that, well, why are we relying on somebody's thought from so many centuries ago? So if you're following Abu Hanifa or Imam Shafi'i or Maliki, the gates of ijtihad were closed so many hundreds of years ago, so why are we relying on that in order to reach contemporary solutions for present-day Muslims?
I think the whole that phrase, the gates of ijtihad are closed, I mean, that's both true and false. I mean, there was definitely a certain coalescing and a kind of a solidification of the various schools of law and also of theology, but that didn't mean that this activity stopped.
Right.
It just meant that it had kind of, you might say, crystallized into a form that was not as much of a free-for-all as, let's say, you had in the original, let's say in the second or third centuries, where there were many legal schools and there were other legal scholars of similar stature to Abu Hanifa and Malik and Shafi and so forth. But, for example, the figure of Layth in Egypt, many people don't know him, but at the time they considered him to be the equal of Imam Malik, for example. But it just didn't turn into a legal school. It just historically crystallized in a certain way. But my question to people who say that is, well, what practically are you going to do? Are you just going to open up the Quran and then open up some books of hadith and start quote mining and start getting things from there?
Right.
Or are you going to first take a look and see, look, we have this tradition which has taken a look at all of these things and use it, but use it critically.
Sure.
I don't think there's a contradiction there. I don't think there's a contradiction between saying, if I'm someone who's studying the Quran, that I'm going to make use of the tafsir tradition, but I'm going to do so in a way that is critical not in the sense of criticizing, but in a way that I'm engaged, I'm making judgments. I'm not simply following, literally what some person I pick arbitrarily says.
Sure.
In any other field in most other fields of intellectual endeavor, people don't usually say, even in the academy, they don't say, well, this is really old, so I'm not going to use it anymore.
Right.
When people study Aristotle, they study the ancient commentaries on Aristotle. When Jews study their own religion, they don't just, traditional Jews, they don't simply throw out the Talmud.
Right.
I mean, they study it as well. It's not an all or nothing equation.
Absolutely.
Just because you use Tabari to understand the Quran doesn't mean that you have to follow every opinion in Tabari, because it's impossible, because he quotes multiple opinions.
Right.
Yes, we have to rely on Muslim scholars to do this work, but at the same time, even ordinary Muslims who aren't scholars are capable, I would say, of being able to look at the activity that someone is doing and make a kind of, you might say, a judgment from a distance as to whether or not what they're doing is even reasonable.
Right.
So just for example, like you can see some of the books I have here.
Yes.
If you look simply physically at the volume of the hadith, if you look physically at the Quran, if you look physically at the legal tradition, and then you take a look at some of the legal opinions that are offered by ISIS, even a person who doesn't know anything about the tradition can, I think, just through rational judgment say, you know, these opinions don't seem to take into account what seem to be an evident diversity of views and problematic opinions and contradictions. And it would seem that in order for you to tell me that I need to kill someone, that you need to provide a little bit more of a substantive argument that somehow takes into account these sources which you claim are authoritative.
Right.
Because your authoritative sources are quite voluminous, but your opinions are pamphlet size.
Exactly.
So can you please tell me where I can then go in order to explore in greater depth? And I think even a person who's not an expert, even a person who is not a master of the tradition, can appreciate and have a kind of an appreciation for the qualifications that are necessary in order to be able to follow someone, in order to do. And we're not just talking about whether you believe that there were 10,000 angels at the Battle of Badr or 5,000 angels. We're talking about telling someone to go and take a life.
Right.
We're talking about serious questions of conduct,
Absolutely.
not tangential theological questions. And to and if you look at the arguments from that point of view, and you compare them with the really serious arguments that were offered in the legal tradition, there's simply no comparison. Even, as I said, even for a non-expert to simply look at it and make a. I'll give you an example. I'm not a scholar of Japanese religion, for example. But if I spent just a day kind of looking at the nature of Japanese religion, Shintoism and other things, and then I think I'd be able to make a reasonable assumption. At least I'd be able to make a beginning as to who was being serious and who is not being serious. I think any person can look at history, they can look at the texts, and they can get a sense as to whether or not a person is a insane zealot or someone who is approaching it with a moderate degree of seriousness.
But for you to reach that determination, perhaps you wouldn't be, you'd have to have an approach that's more sincere and not something that's conditioned by preconceived notions of what that religion is about.
That's absolutely the case. And I think that when you publish a major article in a major publication like The Atlantic, and you then have not actually familiarized yourself with the sources, and then you go on to say that these ISIS fighters are making plausible and coherent interpretations of the Quran and Hadith, when you clearly don't know what these sources even say. This I was extremely angered by. I was very unhappy with this, because when I engaged the author, it became quickly obvious to me that he didn't know the sources very well at all.
Right.
So for example, would I be in a position to say that a Hindu is giving a coherent and plausible reading of the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita? I'm not in a position to say this, because I don't know those sources well enough.
Right.
I am in a position to journalistically report on what others say, but that's not what he did.
Right.
And that's not what is often done in the discourse now.
Right.
This kind of idea that somehow ISIS is authentic or something like that. Well, on what basis?
Sure.
Can you make this judgment?
Sure. Dr. Dagli, we're approaching the end of the program, but I would like for you to perhaps comment on how, Muslim Americans here, again, get very defensive about all of that, that we hear about in the news. What do you think their approach should be, their response should be, just ordinary, American Muslims? Because sometimes they're asked to condemn, sometimes even apologize for the actions of these militant groups. And then what do you think the role of theologians within the Muslim world should be? Some of the major centers, like, Al-Azhar or perhaps Imam Sistani, how should they be responding? Should they be responding?
It's not an easy situation in the United States right now, because there's so much in the media, in the mainstream media, much worse in social media, where a lot of Muslims spend a lot of time, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth and so on. And a person feels a natural urge to disassociate themselves from these kinds of things, because other people are automatically associating them with it. But I think Muslims in general, and I think all Muslims who are dealing, need to make an effort to become just a little bit more politically savvy, and so that they know and they can understand, for example, that when they answer certain kinds of questions or when they offer certain kinds of explanations, they are sometimes reaffirming the very prejudice or bigotry that they are suffering from. And I'll give an example. No Jewish person would accept to answer the question, does Judaism teach that Jews are greedy?
Right.
They would immediately point out that the question itself is offensive and outrageous, and they'd be right. No Christian would, no Catholic, for example, would answer a question, does Catholicism condone pedophilia?
Right.
They would immediately know that this question was, in a sense, an accusation in the form of a question. Muslims, because of their political weakness, their lack of political and cultural clout, they feel much more helpless, and they feel desperate because they know that, in a sense, it's through being framed as uniquely dangerous that invasions of Muslim countries, bombs, drones, surveillance in places here, even now what's becoming a very serious problem, acts of vandalism and assault and so forth and so on. And so they automatically do it, and I can understand that. But we need to get a little bit more serious and turn the tables on people who are expecting these things of us.
Because if we don't answer the questions and say, well, this is just too offensive for me to respond to, then people would say, well, of course, because you're being evasive and you don't want to answer the difficult questions.
Well, that's only because there are people who are always going to be hostile.
Right.
That's simply the case. Just the same way there's always going to be people who don't like Jews, there's going to be people who don't like Catholics, there's going to be people who don't like Muslims. But I think what Muslims need to do is to establish an automatic assumption on the part of their interlocutors that they are not going to put up with the idea that me, a person who has no power over, for example, what ISIS does, I don't benefit from it, and even if I said something, it would only reinforce them in their negative actions because they would just consider me a heretic. I have no accountability. I have no power. And so the idea of associating me with this and asking me to disassociate myself is a way of me affirming that you have the right to collectively blame Muslims.
Absolutely.
And that's something that we need to stop doing. There is a valid thing that people can do, though. I think that it is up to Muslims, and here I think where they're explaining themselves is valid. People want to know what Islam teaches. A lot of people aren't asking the question as a way of accusing people of guilt, but they don't know. They sort of don't understand, they're not familiar with Islam, and the educational element of things, I think Muslims have an obligation to do. You know, people might say, look, I know that my neighbor is not like ISIS, but I don't understand how and like what the difference is, right? So, and that's fair, and that's something that they should address. And the theologians, people like you were mentioning, Azhar and Sistani, they actually have accountability because they have authority, because Muslims look to them, and so they are accountable in the sense that if people are looking to you for guidance, if people are looking to you to say something, then you do have a certain degree of accountability and you should explain your position. I think in those cases it doesn't imply guilt, it doesn't imply collective punishment, it implies that, look, I am a person of authority, I am a person who people listen to, and so I have a responsibility to state my position on these questions. That I think is legitimate. And they've done it, and in fact they've done it voluminously for many years. There was just recently this, it's on the web, the letter to Baghdadi, which was written to the leader of ISIS, refuting them point by point on many of their practices. If you go back to 2005, 2006, there was this Jordanian initiative called the Amman Message, which talked about the inadmissibility of declaring Muslims to be kafirs and establishing the requirements for the qualifications for a person to give a fatwa, these kinds of things. And for someone who's interested, the material is out there. The problem is that we Muslims have, because of, in a sense, our absence, the lack of our clout, economic clout, media clout, cultural clout, we haven't been able to get that into the mainstream, into the public consciousness effectively. Things are getting better. I mean, Muslims are getting more savvy. They're getting a little bit better about these kinds of things like that. But there's a long way to go.
Sure. Dr. Dagli, thank you so much for all of your insights. You gave us so much to think about.
It's a pleasure.
And thank you for your time. Until next time, this is Mahlaka Samdani.